This crisis is the closest to the end of the United States, with the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union entering the white heat. The Soviet Union, forced by the United States, deployed Cuban missiles directly to the back garden of the United States, Cuba. Once the launch pad is built, all cities in the United States will be within the range of nuclear missiles. It only takes a short 5-minute time to blow up 80 million Americans. The President of the United States must have received the news and immediately sent fighter jets to Cuba to deal with the situation. However, when it was about to enter the target area, it was suppressed by the firepower of Soviet Unions for high-altitude aircraft carriers. One of the U.S. military's aircraft was hit to a full blast. But later, in the face of the commander's centrage, the pilot denied that the bullseye on the fuselage was caused by the hit of the Sparrow group. It turned out that the pilot received a special instruction from Kennedy before taking off. No matter how powerful the Soviet Union's firepower is, it cannot admit that it was attacked by the Soviet Union, because once it is caught by the war-loving faction of the Soviet Union, it will launch World War III at any time, threatening the survival of the United States. Taking the last lesson, the U.S. military this time sent a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft to fly in a position where the Soviet Union's high-altitude artillery could not hit, using the bottom of the camera to constantly shoot. Finally, it was handed over to the U.S. Security Department. After careful observation by military experts, they found that the white stripes that seemed to be ranged on the photo were really the most advanced SS for medium-range missiles of the Soviet Union. The number of missiles was 4 times that of the Soviet Union. There were 32 missiles in total. Realizing the seriousness of the problem, Kennedy held an emergency meeting in the White House overnight to discuss countermeasures. Finally, he decided to warn the Soviet Union through the TV station. Now you have to dismantle the missile launch pad, evacuate all the missiles, otherwise we will declare this behavior as a declaration of war. But the Soviet Union did not ignore them at all. Not only did it no retreat, but it sent more cargo ships to transport arms to Cuba. Faced with such a naked provocation, the American war-loving faction suddenly got angry and jumped over the wall, threatening Kennedy to issue an order to start a war. And sir, given your own statements about Cuba, I suspect that many of our own citizens might feel the same way, but you're in a pretty bad place at this present time. Faced with the strong pressure of the war-loving faction, Kennedy still refused to start a war and online ordered the blockade of Cuba. The war-loving faction, confused, hurried out of the White House. However, just when Kennedy sent 8 strategic warships, 68 fighter jets, and 20,000 U.S. troops talking about to implement the blockade, the war-loving faction set up its own team and detonated a green bomb in the South Pacific in order to demonstrate to the Soviet Union that it was deploying nuclear missiles in Cuba. However, President Kennedy of the United States, as the commander-in-chief of the 3 armies, had no idea about the green bomb. It turns out that the war-loving faction of the United States thought that Kennedy's methods of blocking and not starting a war were too cowardly, so they tried to frame that president and start a war. However, this stupid move not only did not deter the Soviet Union, but also put 80 million American people in panic. They thought that the U.S. Soviet Union was about to start a war, so they began to buy supplies mainly, dragging their families and hiding in air raid shelters, which led to the collapse of the U.S. economy. In order to appease the people, Kennedy immediately sent 8 strategic warships, 68 fighter jets, and 20,000 U.S. troops to Cuba to implement the blockade. But as the strategic warships arrived at the designated coastline, all the officials in the Pentagon were in a hurry because they were afraid that the Soviet Union would ignore the blockade and break through the blockade line. As expected, when the Soviet Union saw the U.S. military warships, it did not ignore the existence of the U.S. military. At the same time, the U.S. military sonar suddenly detected a Soviet nuclear submarine enter the water. It immediately sent a message to the U.S. Navy, saying, "Hurry up and send the message back to the Pentagon," and ordered all soldiers to enter combat readiness. Kennedy was in trouble again. If the Soviet Union's nuclear warships were stopped, the submarine under the water would likely hit the strategic warships. But if you let the nuclear warships pass, it is impossible to give the people an answer. After a brief thought, Kennedy immediately contacted the Navy and asked him to push the Soviet nuclear submarine out of the water in the absence of casualties. In fact, the Navy had just put the anti-submarine torpedo into the cannon, and the Soviet cargo ship was turning the ship around like a monkey. The U.S. officials thought the Soviet Union was cowardly, so they slapped Kennedy with a big mouth and applauded him. Who knows? This is just a way for the Soviet Union to confuse the U.S. Navy. It can only be seen that there are still 6 Soviet cargo ships forced into the blockade line and turning around cargo ship fleet. And these 6 cargo ships also let the U.S. main battalion seize the opportunity, order 68 fighter jets to take off and fly to Cuba, and at the same time activate the assault missiles, and be ready to bomb the Soviet army at any time. Seeing that the U.S. military was shooting fiercely, the Soviet Union did not dare to show weakness, and immediately launched short-range missiles against Washington. Kennedy was furious, and every time he made his own decision, he pushed the United States to a desperate situation. But at this point, he could only abandon internal contradictions and prioritize solving the Cuban Missile Crisis. After careful consideration, Kennedy finally issued an attack command. At that moment, Kennedy sent a reconnaissance plane for the third time to Cuba for the last enemy reconnaissance over the attack. After the Soviet army found it, to land-based air missiles were fired. The scouts heard the alarm and immediately held their hands tightly and turned their heads to evade the attack. But the missile was too fast, and it flew right in front of their eyes in an instant. The U.S. war-loving faction learned of this and was angry and asked the president to implement that plan to bomb Cuba. But Kennedy thought about it over and over again, and finally shook his head. Had figured out whether the Soviet army had as little time as possible to delay the war. However, just when the war-loving faction and the conservative faction were arguing, Soviet President Khrushchev secretly sent a secret message to Kennedy. In the letter, he said, "As long as the United States withdraws the missile base deployed in Turkey, we will agree to withdraw from Cuba." When he learned of the Soviets' request, Kennedy sighed temporarily. He understood that Khrushchev didn't want to do it either. It's just that the Soviet war-loving faction kept pressing him, so Khrushchev had no choice but to deploy missiles in Cuba. As for Turkey's U.S. missile base, Kennedy had the idea of withdrawing it from the moment he took office. But he hadn't found the right time yet. Now that the Soviet Union has asked for it, he will withdraw it from Turkey in the blink of an eye. But at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, it will be time for the two sides to start the war. The war-loving factions of two countries have been waiting for the news. Yuan is constantly injecting fuel into the missiles. In order to reach an agreement with the Soviet Union before the war, Kennedy sent his most trusted brother, Bob, to the Soviet-American embassy overnight for negotiations. According to Kennedy's instructions, Bob did a great job. As long as the Soviet Union withdraws the missiles deployed in Cuba and allows the United Nations to inspect, the United States will withdraw all missiles from Turkey within 6 months. But in order to prevent the two countries' war-loving factions from fighting each other, this agreement can only be signed or exposed by the leaders of both sides. Otherwise, the U.S. will launch a one-sided four-way agreement. The next morning, Kennedy responded to Khrushchev in the telegraph room. It was so ugly that half of it was stuck in. Khrushchev finally sent a telegram. He agreed to withdraw 30 missiles deployed in Cuba. Then Kennedy announced in the broadcast day it would cancel the naval blockade of Cuba. That's it. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which has made the American people panic, was completely lifted 13 days later in history.